because this might be the inner chronicle of what we are, and we have to articulate ourselves, otherwise we would be cows in a field.
Welcome to Cows in the Field. This is a movie podcast inspired by the jungle-crazed musings of Werner Herzog. My name is Justin.
I'm Laura.
And today we are very, very, very excited to be joined by Tom Shone, film critic and author of many books on film and filmmakers, including Quentin Tarantino, Martin Scorsese, and Woody Allen. Recently, he published The Nolan Variations, his long-form study of the films of Christopher Nolan. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Very nice to be with you both. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much. We're very excited to have you. So we were just talking before here a bit about Christopher Nolan, and the question I asked you, I mean, you don't have to repeat yourself, but I'm fascinated by what you had said in the answer. So I think of Christopher Nolan as the analytic philosopher of directors. He has a mind that it comes out in his movies that is deeply philosophical, but it's philosophical in a particular analytic way, in that it is a mind that seems to be obsessed with logic, recursion, mathematics, science, the rigor. These are the kinds of things that are brought to bear in analytic philosophy. These are like the tools we use to try to understand the world. And so I asked you, I said, did Nolan study philosophy at all? And you told us that...
Yeah, no, he hasn't, because I asked him that because I, too, had found, I should say from the outset, I haven't studied philosophy, but I can see just from reading the kind of the writing around his work that people have found sort of a lot of profundity in his films. So I asked him, had he ever read any philosophy, and he said no. It's interesting, like, as you were speaking then, I was thinking, like, sort of my basic take on him was that he was like very logical, super rational, and sort of obsessed in his films with the idea of rationality breaking down. It's like, I called him like a traumatized rationalist. Like he reminded me of like one of those kind of really logical Victorian gentlemen who absolutely puts his faith in kind of the rational method. And I'm thinking here of people like Sherlock Holmes, and Conan Doyle and all those guys that just sort of, those Victorian brains that just kind of bent the world to their will. And he was just like that, but he was somehow, he'd been transported into kind of Einstein's universe. And so he was this Victorian with the kind of looking glass trying to make sense of like Einstein's universe, and then finding it kind of boggling his sort of lens and his mind. And so he definitely is very, very rational and very logical. And, he really, you can tell that just sort of talking to him. But the obsession really, it seems, of his films, and particularly I think that the two that feel the closest to him, Memento and Inception, is what if our heads are deceived, or even worse, what if our heads are lying to us? Like that seems to me like to be the kind of fear that's kind of underlying his work, and which he explores. And I don't think it's, as I say, from somebody who, has sort of read a lot of philosophy necessarily, and he'll say so. But it comes from this sort of place of basic, I think it's a fear. I think it's like it's a rationalist fear. What if everything for somebody who puts so much faith in like in his own mind, what if I'm just totally awfully wrong?
That I think is I think it's a really interesting take on Nolan, because the rationalists, I think, are in a way they struggle a lot with the kind of skepticism that you're describing and often attributing to Nolan. I mean, it definitely in Memento and also in Inception, this kind of fear that like you might be massively deceived, or I mean, in the case of Memento, you might be deceiving yourself. This like what's scary to the rationalist is that you expect that you can just reason your way out of it. Like if you just get the proof right, you can figure it out. All the pieces will come together and you'll have the sort of proof. And Descartes, actually, one of the rationalists, thought he could do that. So he thought he had a proof that defeated his own skepticism that he's sort of famous for. So he thought that he could base an entire epistemology on the famous quote is the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Fine, I know I exist, but do I know anything else does? And he thought he had a proof of this. Of course, the proof had to go through, like, he had to prove God's existence, and he had to prove that God wouldn't deceive you, and then so on. So it's it's a kind of move which many people were not persuaded by, but that's the kind of tools you have at your disposal if you're a rationalist who are trying to solve this problem. And I remember, actually, this is why I got into philosophy, actually. I don't know, do you know this, Laura?
I don't think so.
I was gripped by the problem of skepticism as an undergrad. And it actually, like, caused me deep anxiety. It caused me, I lost a lot of sleep. I thought, how can I establish to a level of degree of certainty that would satisfy me that there is anything outside of my own experiences? That deeply worried me. And it sounds like it's fascinating that also seems to be something, I mean, on your read that Nolan's grappling with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I came to, I sort of came to it partly because I just sort of noticed how many protagonists of his grapple with their knowledge, and I came to see that, like, there was this very dangerous kind of verb in his work, which was to know. Like, anybody who ever says they know something in his films is sort of like, it's something terrible that's about to happen, and it becomes like the obsession of some of his characters is like, I'm thinking here of The Prestige, where Hugh Jackman is trying to find out whether Christian Bale intentionally tied the knot that ended up killing Jackman's wife, or whether it was just a mistake. And he finds his diary, and in the diary, Christian Bale just says, I don't know. And Hugh Jackman hurls the book across the room and says, how can he not know? How can he not know? And it's like, and I actually think that is like that's the kind of eternal kind of Christopher Nolan cry. It's like, how can we not know? And that's the sort of, and the reason why it's kind of given him so much, it's a very fruitful question to ask if you're making movies in a genre in which sort of knowing things or finding things out is paramount, like either detective, fiction, or noir, or any of those kind of crime thrillers where the finding out of stuff is the sort of basic engine of the plot. And he kind of really likes taking that engine and then just sort of, if you like, driving it backwards or dismantling it in front of our eyes, or but it's and again, like, he would say that just comes from my interest in film noir. If you pressed him on it, he wouldn't sort of he's very he doesn't like to be cornered in terms of theme or I think his ideal, he doesn't even really, I think, like to think of himself as having that much of a message. You'd ask him about well, here, what you're saying is his, and he would, no. I was, thinking of it in genre terms. I was making a thriller. And so there's a bit of a kind of disappearing magician quality to him. Like, whenever you try and you think you've caught him saying something, he'll sort of disappear into the ether.
The thing you're saying about knowledge, but I want to also bring it back to self-deception, because that is this other element that I think there's this real interesting connection between that and his sort of unwillingness to reveal, like, these deeper things. So we have in Memento, we have self-deception at the end. We have in The Prestige, we have a kind of self-deception because you've got one person who's two. The reason why, I think is Borgia or whatever. Anyway, Christopher Bale's character doesn't know is it's because the other Bale tied the knot, right? The other, whatever, his twin or whatever. So there's a kind of self-deception because the guy is divided. And then in Inception, there's a kind of self-deception potentially at the end where Cobb walks away from the spinning top. I wonder if this is what we're getting at. Is it's not that like our minds aren't great enough to solve skepticism, but rather it's this issue of like we don't want to solve it. It's like to solve it would be too scary, so we have to deceive ourselves, and we're like dealing with this kind of self-deception again and again. And I suspect that maybe that's why he doesn't want to reveal these kind of autobiographical details. It's in a way, it's kind of like, no, what I'm doing is I'm kind of carrying out this kind of self-deception with my movies. And it would break the illusion for me to come into this too much. Also, to bring it back to genre, as you pointed out, a lot of that is going on in these noirs. Like I was thinking in particular of The Big Sleep, which is, as far as I can tell, a movie that I can't totally make sense of. But I think, but there's like a lot of stuff if I remember correctly, right? There's a lot of stuff in the movie where the characters are like deceiving themselves. And I mean, at least that's a theme that comes up again and again in film noir.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, what you just said, I think would connect with him on the idea, the thing that he finds, again, you sort of running through his work, is this idea that we can only take too much reality. And, you know, self-deception is kind of essential to kind of get through the day. And, you know, so that, I think that's in The Prestige too. I think he says, you know, just to get away from all this, and he hits the wall, doesn't he, with his fist? Like the solidity of the wall kind of stands for sort of mundane, imprisoning reality, and the magic kind of allows them to escape it. So it kind of, there you see it kind of connects with that kind of entertainer's desire to, if you like, take us away from, you know, our kind of mundane reality. The thing that's weird about Nolan is that, like, he's like a kind of pessimistic fantasist. You know, normally, you know, fantasists, you know, they tend to be kind of optimists. At least that's in my experience. But, you know, he's kind of quite pessimistic, I think, in his cast of mind. And, you know, so there was always this sort of sense in which he wants us to escape, and he gives us the mechanism to escape in his films, but then he kind of booby traps it a little bit. And he makes us conscious that that's what we're doing. You're just trying to escape, folks. And you're like, God, this is such a strange message for like a Hollywood entertainer to kind of give us, to kind of yank the chain a little bit and just remind us that we're all trying to escape our lives as we watch these sort of fantasies that are unfolding. So it's a very curious mixture of, like, on the one hand, he absolutely demands that he be able to escape his kind of mundane reality into the film. Like, and it's like a real demand. It's like a hunger. Like, he absolutely must have, you know, the screen must fill your vision. The sound must be overwhelming. The music must take you there. So there's that kind of devotion to kind of doing that for himself and for the audience. And at the same time, he, like, once you're there, once you're in the palm of his hand, he'll then yank out the carpet from under you and give you these kind of second act twists that make you wonder whether you've been entirely told the truth about anything. So he's very curious. He then booby traps his own kind of urge towards fantasy, and that's very much in Inception for sure. I think that's being the absolute archetypal expression of that double, you know, and it's a strange thing for, again, a Hollywood filmmaker necessarily to be as that ambivalent about fantasy. I mean, normally they'll regard fantasy as just the sort of, they were in much more uncritical or unquestioning a way, but he's profoundly sort of ambivalent about it, I think.
I mean, we could move into Inception, because actually a couple of things that you said there reminded me of some stuff, but that will connect up to Inception. But do you want to jump in on any of this, Laura?
Oh, I was just thinking about the scene in Yusef's basement that sort of looks like an opium den where they're all hooked up, and he says, you know, the dream is their reality, and who are you to say otherwise? I hadn't actually thought about it. That fact is that, like, we are that group in the opium den. Like, of course, I know that this movie is a film about filmmaking, and I've always sort of thought about me as, like, you know, me as the audience member. I'm perhaps, like, one of the characters on the cool first class jet plane. I'm cool and dreaming and having this fantasy. But in fact, we are also the people in the opium den hooked up
That's a really
and addicted to it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. I hadn't really thought about it, but when you bring those two gangs of sleepers together and that image, the jet versus the opium den, that's exactly it. That's exactly that kind of light and dark version of kind of what it is to escape.
Let's talk a bit about this, because you brought up the opium den thing. So now we're shifting a little bit into Inception here. One of the things that ties on to this issue of ambivalence, and the ambivalence in particular of blockbuster filmmaking, which of course Nolan has set out to be the vanguard of, and not necessarily be the person to save cinema, but he's one of the people who's trying to help cinemas and the cinematic experience. But I do think that the dream sharing analogy, so we're getting into the dream sharing analogy as kind of the film experience as a sort of shared dream, is treated with a kind of, there is this ambivalence. And one aspect of it is that the characters discuss the dream sharing thing as an addiction. So it's again and again discussed as like, reality won't be enough anymore. Like now you're going to need the real stuff. And they, of course, it looks like heroin. I mean, they're like putting these things in their veins and they're all connected and so on. So the imagery itself is like drugs. And then, of course, there's the opium den. But at the same time, it's elevated, right? As you're putting it, Tom, like he wants you to escape into this fantasy world. But I think there's this understanding of like the danger of doing so, and getting lost in the world is what happens with Cobb and Maul. And so there is this sort of dual nature of the experience. And I hadn't thought of it in terms of ambivalence though. So you putting it in that way, I think is really, really, really is fascinating. Do you have more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought of like, I always thought that like Mal and Cobb were two addicts.
Yeah.
And she was inviting him to stay high all the time, really, is sort of one way of looking at it, like Sid and Nancy or something. And I always felt too that like what she's offering him is to him genuinely attractive. That scene I think it's near the end, where they're in that beautifully designed house that's kind of got the sunlight glancing off the wood. It's all looks, it's just an architectural delight. And Marion Cotillard is just pleading with him, like, just why would you want to leave this? And the way the scene is shot and the way her performance has been directed, everything is saying, this is sincere, this is solid. This environment is obviously very, and so it's very, I really felt in that scene, like DiCaprio's just wrench. I mean, he has to tear himself away and say no. And it's only his children that are sort of, now at the back of his mind. No, I want to live in the real world. And you really feel like in that scene, I think you're just really seeing the two sides of kind of Nolan, just sort of ripping DiCaprio apart. But yeah, like,
I think it's also really interesting that the case that she makes to him is a rational case. So the case that she makes is that that level that he wants to get back to is itself a dream. So she makes she makes the case there, which is the case that I think, some people latch onto when they claim that he's still dreaming at the end. But she's like, look, let me lay it out for you, right? She's like, Cobalt Engineering pursues you around the world, nameless corporations. You got this dream sharing technology. That's pretty fantastical. All this stuff is just like, it's like such a fantasy, and it's exactly right and so it's fascinating again that she makes the appeal not on an emotional level necessarily, but on like the rational level. And you're right that it's the emotions that bring him back that sort of get him to, I don't know.
It's a great speech. You've reminded me of like one of the things that's so delightful about it is that she's basically saying, don't the plots of most spy thrillers sound like the ravings of a paranoid lunatic when you really when you really listen to them. Like Cary Grant in North by Northwest, if he asked to tell you what he was up to, this is how he would sound.
Yeah.
You know, like you're deranged. These people are not pursuing you. You know.
I know the scene in Mombasa always still feels like a dream to me. Different tail. He's got two tails, and he gets stuck in a wall at one point. It does feel it's so dreamlike. I love that sequence.
I know it's real, Mo.
No creeping doubts. Not feeling persecuted, Dom. Chased around the globe by anonymous corporations and police forces. The weather projections persecute the dreamer. Admit it. You don't believe in one reality anymore. So choose. Choose to be here. Choose me.
Let's talk a little bit about because we're on this film as shared dreaming analogy, but I think there's some interesting points here that just kind of draw this out. And here's how I'll frame this. So in the book, so this is just a shout out to the Nolan Variations, which everyone should check out because it's fantastic. You noted that in A.O. Scott's review of the movie, the complaint was, and I think this is a complaint that I've seen in many places, but this is supposed to be about dreaming, but like nothing about this feels like a dream. It's too hard edged. Everything, the dream is ineffable. It's this kind of things floating in and out. You're not quite sure what's happening. But everything feels rigid and logical, and there are rules. And he's like, it couldn't be anything further from a dream. But I actually think, and you made a great case in the book that actually this is like a sort of the Victorian era version of dreaming. But I just want to build on this and feel free to jump in at any point. But so one other aspect of which I think is, a wonderful distillation of the dreaming thing comes when Cobb is explaining to Ariadne about just, we're in the dream, but you never really, how did we get here? How did we get to this cafe in Paris? And that is, an interesting piece of analogy between dreams and films, which is that films always, use cuts to eliminate extraneous stuff in the purpose of pacing, in the purpose of, just to keep the runtime down and so on. You don't need to know all the connective tissue. That's not necessary. The audience can pick it up via context clues, or just if it's a montage, just by seeing how the things are intercut. And I think that is an aspect that I think is similar to dreaming, and I think that's a really, it's aptly done in the movie. And one other place where it's done, just to push this point a little bit further, is and something you also talk about, but in the context of I can't remember if it's in the context of The Prestige or in Dunkirk, but is the Shepard tone. And so just for the audience, if they're not familiar with the Shepard tone, so the Shepard tone basically is this parallel series of rising notes, one of which is, several octaves higher than the other. And as the upper one gets higher and higher, it goes out of the range of human hearing. So it just gets quieter and quieter. And the lower one comes in from the lower range of human hearing into the sort of range of hearing. So, and these things are just kind of going simultaneously. And then when the one gets out of reach, it kind of comes back down to the bottom. And it just sounds, as a result, like this constantly rising single pitch. And Nolan in Dunkirk, I remember that's when I first learned about it, was in the context of Dunkirk. It's that he's using this sort of Shepard tone thing in the music to kind of continue push the action, to a climax and then to a climax, and it never like relents. And he's doing this here in Inception, I think. And really, this is for me the first time I'm seeing it in Nolan, I think, where he's using cutting, like the kind of cuts of the dream, removing the connective tissue, to make the pacing of the movie relentless in a way that it couldn't otherwise be. So intercutting between these 4 or 5 sequences simultaneously, it allows him to sustain that pace as one part of the film, kind of as one line or whatever goes on a downswell, the other one is on the upswell. So you kind of are always getting the action going up and up and up. And that's just so I mean, that's just such innovative, I don't know, blockbuster action filmmaking. It's the sort of thing that I haven't seen anywhere. And I love that it's integrated into the sort of the dream logic.
Definitely. I mean, he's very, I think he quite happily, if people were to say to him, this seems to be a movie more about movies than it is about dreams, I think he happily kind of cops to that. I don't think he, he doesn't mind too much if people point that out, because he's pretty convinced that movies are very similar to dreams anyway, which is a really interesting idea, and it's certainly one that a lot of filmmakers have kind of stumbled across. And there's a large number of his movies, even the ones that aren't about dreams, begin with somebody waking up from a dream. Interstellar does, and Batman Begins does, and there's one other. But yeah, so the idea of like this sort of 2-hour adventure as is something that you kind of almost sort of dream to yourself is very it's very kind of dear to him. So I don't think he sees too much difference between the two. I mean, as to the the clarity thing, I mean, it's a weird convention, isn't it, that like kind of the dreams in movies, at least, they're always supposed to be fuzzy and bendy and like the sort of swirly line. You think of that as the convention that tells you that there's a dream going on. But actually, I mean, dreams are pretty clear. I mean, what they have is kind of, they're crystal clear, at least in sort of my experience, but they can be kind of underpopulated. Like your dream doesn't sort of fill out the cast entirely. I mean, I always remembered that from like early surrealist paintings, and I always remember what they did was they were painting kind of empty cities, weren't they? Like kind of cityscapes, and there was something kind of that was a sort of definitely a dreamlike quality, and Nolan has that too, because his LA is kind of there's not that many people on the street. So but there is definitely, I think for him, like it's as much really a movie about fantasy, really, as and an escape as it is sort of as it is dreaming. I mean, he's no kind of Freudian. I mean, he doesn't. I mean, this is what I mean about him being kind of almost Victorian. Like he doesn't really see. I mean, everybody sort of said, "Well, where's the sex in Inception? Wouldn't there be sex? Because then that would be the kind of classic kind of Freudian take." And he definitely does not. He has an issue with Freud. I mean, he said as much, and he doesn't sort of buy into it, as I think, in fact, maybe a lot of people don't anymore. I mean, I think people do tend to think of some of the symbol hunting that kind of Freud went in for as being kind of more almost like a literary exercise than an analytical one. But dreams and movies may be connected. I mean, the movie kind of first, the plot of Inception first came to him, at night. He would be in his bed at school, is in a dormitory, it's a boarding school, and the kind of the arrangement of that dormitory is there in Inception. It's there in the opium den, all these kind of beds lined up in a sort of long repetitive pattern, all made of metal, quite harsh, and sort of in that environment he didn't have, it was a very kind of old-fashioned school, so the most he had was a Walkman, so he would listen to his Walkman and use the Walkman to kind of cue up whatever sort of plot he was spinning to himself to amuse himself at night, as everybody else all the other boys in the dorm are all either asleep or pretending to be, and he would be there in the dark listening to Vangelis or whatever it is, and telling stories to himself. It's so, I mean, you can see almost all the elements of Inception are almost already there, the beds in this sort of long repetitive pattern, the idea of kind of dream as as an escape from sort of quotidian reality, and then also the use of music to kind of cue the dream. I mean, that's all in Inception. So, where and when he came up with it, I kind of feel it's in the movie. I was so interested in that. I actually thought that to me did explain a lot about, some of the architecture in his, in his films, that kind of very recursive kind of pattern that you see everywhere. You see that in the dorm. And also I think like that just absolute necessity that like the fantasy work, that that it take you out of where you are. There's a kind of great tradition of like, writers who had a miserable time at boarding school who escaped into their imaginations, and it was the only thing keeping them sane, and it really was like oxygen. And you see this in accounts of particularly, the older ones when the school was a little bit more draconian. But it's like oxygen. I mean, it's not just some luxury.
Yeah.
I mean, it absolutely has to work. The story that you're telling yourself at night as you're trying to escape the reality, I mean, it just has to work. And I definitely feel that pressure in his work. You can just feel it. Like, it's not, fantasy for him is not some kind of poor man's version of reality. It's like, it's as real as reality. It has to be better than reality. Like, there's this kind of real need for that to be so in his work, I think. And that's kind of what I think really, underlies all of them. And it definitely makes him the filmmaker he is.
I mean, when I think of Nolan and the look of Nolan, I mean, it's like Escher all the way. And part for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that Escher is the kind of art that when you look at it, you think initially it makes sense. And it's fully realized, and it's not at all like, like an impressionist or
painterly,
it's painterly or anything. It's like, it looks like it's purely representational, but of course what it represents is impossible. And I feel like that's a way of thinking about Inception. And it's also a way of thinking about the dream logic behind Inception. So just to bring back to this issue or analogy between dreaming and filmmaking, I mean, there's this thing that Cobb says. He says, dreams feel real when we're in them, and it's only when we wake up we realize something was strange. And I think that is another aspect of films as well. Just as you were saying earlier, Tom, about how if you were to just describe the plot of, any thriller movie or whatever, it just, you'll sound like a lunatic. It's like trying to tell someone what is happening in Inception, besides in just the broad strokes. Like, some people have to plant an idea in someone's mind. Like, you very quickly start to sound like a lunatic, and your audience is going to be like, wait, what's going on? How many layers? And it's so complicated. And it's also, here's another thing that I think is interesting about Inception, and this is true of a lot of Nolan movies, but in particular about Inception, like, I had to think really hard. I've seen this movie a number of times, but I had to think really hard about when some of the exposition comes in, because I think a lot of people think the movie is like, either they'll say it's mostly exposition, or they'll think like, oh no, I always thought the first third was exposition, the second third was just action. But that's actually not right, because there's quite a bit of exposition peppered throughout the second third, or the second 2/3. And it's one of these things where, because it keeps getting repeated, there's this kind of repetition happening where the ideas the lines keep getting repeated. They revisit the same scene in different ways. It's easy to forget when you're in, when you're thinking back, like, where were we when Cobb for the second time said the old man filled with regret or something? When you're in it, it makes perfect sense. It's everything. You're like, yeah, I know when I'm cutting to memory or to some, fantasy and I know where I am. Am I in limbo at that point or whatever? But when you try to think back on it, it's incredibly difficult to like remember how these things are actually arrayed. And I feel like that is a lot like The Dream, where it's like, it just kind of, as soon as the credits roll or you wake up, you're like, you're struggling deeply to remember what happened.
It's just coming through your fingers like sand.
Yeah,
it feels so clear the second you wake up, and then as soon as you try to articulate to somebody else, you're like, you were there, but also you were a cat.
And often I think it's people who didn't see Inception, but like had someone tell them Inception, what the plot was, that came up with, who are good at finding plot inconsistencies, right? It's like notorious for having all these like quote unquote plot holes. But But of course, that's the sort of thing you're not really thinking about in the movie. You should not be thinking about like, why doesn't Cobb just
send his kids to France,
right? Like that kind of question should not cross your mind. It should just be like, he needs to get to the US. Like that's all that matters. But of course, once you pause the movie or get outside of it, or you tell someone, it's really obvious to them. But I think that is the kind of magic of the filmmaking.
I think definitely. I mean, it's really. I think you're putting your finger on kind of one of the reasons I, love Inception so much. It's probably my favorite of his, and it's because of that quality of. It's the one where I would find, almost a lot of the other films. If you had told me when I was 16 that there was going to be like a really great Batman movie, let's say, like as a 16-year-old, I would have been able to sort of imagine that, and it would have, or Magicians or whatever it is. But when you come to Inception, I think there was just simply no way I could have ever made that sound like it was going to work to anybody. And my 16-year-old self would have just been like, no, I just don't get it. And then you watch it, and it really shows you that the film is this experiential thing. I mean, that's the thing that he is so interested in, is that the experience of watching a movie, like what happens to you, like kind of Pauline Kael used to come out of a movie and she would always say, like, at the beginning of her review was always, what just happened to me? Like that was the thing. Like it was almost like a physiological thing. What had just happened to her body, And he's very interested in that and very driven by that. And it's true that the movies are very hard to summarize, and you should quickly sound like a bit of a lunatic if you try to. And so it's curious. And then as to the holes, I mean, he never likes to admit to those things. I sort of found and everybody delights in sort of finding them. It's like a kind of, it's such a weird. He's got himself into an interesting corner because the movies are so clearly smart and written and directed by a smart guy. And I always find myself, if I'm not careful, almost getting into a kind of game of chess with him a little bit. Like you're just trying to outwit the filmmaker. And I think he has both invited that, but also I think he's now become to kind of regret it a little bit. Like he doesn't like that he's subjected to such kind of rigorous kind of analysis. And I think in Interstellar, I think it kind of drove him a little bit crazy that he wasn't being allowed the same kind of latitude that like filmmakers, habitually enjoy, just because Nolan fans tend to sort of think about these things a little bit more than most, or at least when it comes to his movies, they kind of expect a little bit more.
I do feel though that Inception is a movie that people, and I've had these conversations with people, that people get irritated by the fact that the movie itself doesn't seem to follow its own rules. And I think that is, or at least that there are plot inconsistencies or plot holes. And I think myself that response to the movie, perhaps like yourself, is both invited, but I think that's Nolan actually playing with the audience, because I think actually that, as Cobb himself puts it, the dream makes sense when we're in it, and when we leave it, it doesn't make sense. And what is the analogy here? The film is the dream. So when you leave the dream, it's not supposed to make sense. It's supposed to have these holes. It's supposed to have these elements where when you really think about it, you're like, it doesn't actually make sense. I think those are all purposeful. And I think insofar as they're not purposeful, the fact that he's deliberately leaving holes that aren't filled and don't have, and maybe he didn't think it was purposeful, that there was no natural way to fill them, I think is actually adds to the analogy of the film. And so the way that I take it is that, if you're worried about like I'll give you one of them that I think is fascinating and that people typically don't point out, but I think is really interesting, is that when Cobb goes into the hotel room and this is where he's revisiting this memory of Maul jumping from the ledge. She's actually not on the ledge of the hotel room. She's on a completely different, across a across the road on a completely different building, and they're having this conversation across the road. So like, first of all, like the room he goes in is supposed to be the room they rented together or whatever. And that's supposed to be the room she jumps from, but she's jumping from a completely different room across the way. And forensics would figure that out and everything. So it's not.
Oh, right. The forensics part.
Well, you know,
I was like, she could have just gotten,
sure, she could have got the other room.
She got declared sane by 3 people. She did a lot of planning.
Yeah. But she clearly was not pushed by him.
Yeah.
She clearly jumped from the other room. But I think what's interesting is that that's all there, but you don't think about any of that when you're watching the movie because it's so much more cinematic and better to have them have that conversation that way rather than have them try to have that conversation where he's, can actually reach her or whatever and pull her back in.
Well, I mean, he'd be really pleased to hear that because that's exactly the kind of thing that he wants to get away with, that he wants to avail himself of. Like it's sort of like, and I totally agree. Until you said that, it literally had not occurred to me. But it has also struck me that I rather like the arrangement of like him and her on separate sides. I mean, it is very cinematic, and it also means that he can't grab her.
Yes.
So it's like But yeah, I mean, the big one for me actually, because I can remember having been kind of conned by movies in the past, was with Inception. It was the fact that dying in a dream, is supposed to wake you up, except when they get halfway into the story, and then it doesn't. Then it sends you further down into limbo.
Yeah.
But the thing is, and at the time I was like, this reminds me a little bit of the way in which I've been sort of conned in the past. Like because that's the big struggle, isn't it, with virtual reality movies? Is like, how on earth do you make it matter?
Yep.
But because the reason maybe I'm inclined to kind of smile on this is because it does give us limbo, and limbo is such a kind of fantastic kind of concept setting idea. It's such an attractive one. The idea of like you go down there and spend 50 years, like it's so resonant that who would not want that? Who would not want that in the film? And so the idea that you kind of get sent, I'm willing to kind of forgive it because in other words, he's thought it through, and it's taken him to an interesting place. He's kind of thought through the plot hole, if you like, but then there's another world on the other side of it, and it's like, and it's pretty, and it's interesting. So,
I mean, on that point, it raises the stakes in 2 ways. One, it raises the stakes that you could get trapped down there and your brain would turn to mush or whatever they say. But the other is that if Saito's the one who's gonna die, and he's the one they do not want his brain to turn to mush, because if his brain turns to mush, then Cobb has just gone on a plane where if the call is not made, that's it. Like he goes to jail for the rest of his life, which has already been set up. So it's absolutely imperative that if anyone's going to go to limbo, it not be Saito, and unfortunately, he's the one who's headed there. So it just raises the stakes. Whereas if you didn't have that, you might not really care that much about Saito. You're like when Eames is like, let's just kill him. That was exactly my thought at that moment. I was like, yeah, just like get him out of here. He doesn't need to be here. And so I really liked that it's not only, it makes you now suddenly care about what happens to Saito like a lot more. And who's otherwise, not as consequential a character for the plot stuff at that point in the movie.
Definitely, and it's sort of it's always sort of interesting. Like it's his. I always find the scene where he returns to the table, and he's saying, "Come, let's kind of be young men again together." And that line, I don't know if I'm quoting it exactly, but it's like that scene to me has a real emotional kick. And there are 2 big emotional kicks. One is the sort of Marl, the goodbye to Marl, essentially. But then I find just as affecting, the rescue of Saito, and like the fact that he goes back for him, and the fact that he kind of sort of awakens him with that kind of line about kind of going to be young men again. And it's very evocative, and it's and again, I sort of think it sort of gives the lie to the Nolan as kind of unemotional filmmaker, which is the critical thing. It's like, I always found that Inception is like, in particular, there's all sorts of emotion kind of thrumming through it. Of a very kind of peculiar, interesting kind. I mean, it's such that climax, it's so interesting. Like,
can I say one thing on the line that I love that line as well? I was actually thinking, just when you said it here, I was actually thinking, reminded me of something we were just talking about earlier, which is that normally when you would say to someone, let's go be old men together again, what would that mean? Well, or young men together again, excuse me. Well, you can't go time travel. So what would it mean? It would mean like, let's go like revisit the past and our memories, or let's watch a home video or something. And so interesting that they're going back to their reality, quote unquote, which is really just like the main sort of plot line of the film. But that's the only way we can revisit our old selves as young people again, is through the medium of either memory or of sort of some recorded medium. So dreams, exactly. So it is like this kind of interesting, I don't know, denouement. It like brings it all back together. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it's got all the sort of the emotional charge of memory, and then it's got all the satisfactions of being actually, for them, their reality. They actually are going to go and be young together again. It's like a dream fully realized. I mean, it's it's a lovely scene. I mean, and I think the one flaw I think he ever pointed out in the film for me was that Saito's age, his makeup he looks much, much older than Cobb. And he said because that's what DiCaprio wanted. He wanted just a smattering of it. He didn't want to do full old age makeup. And the way he justified it to himself as a filmmaker was, Sato's been down there longer and therefore, but it was interesting. Like he was, I mean, but it bothered him. He was like, he had to work out at first. He was like, oh, no, they should both be the same. And that was the only flaw I think he ever pointed out to me. But but as always, he has a reason, he has he had some thinking around it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. He lays out the rules so well for you. And I'm so bought in at that point with the time dilation that, when you see Saito so much older, I was like, well, yeah, I guess he went to limbo like 3 minutes before, that's 100 years in limbo time. Sure. I didn't even question it.
Yeah, that's right. I think maybe it's interesting. It may be one of those cases where, I mean, the way, when he told me that story, I read that as DiCaprio, the actor, did not want to be in age-old makeup just for vanity, for vanity's sake. He didn't want to do that. Or maybe felt that it was just maybe pushing absurdity if he's the hero. There are kind of certain rules for kind of being the hero of a big movie like that. And maybe he had an instinct that like audiences wouldn't want to see him that old or whatever the reason was. But I think because it had come to Nolan out of left field, he kind of, it startled him, and then he had to sort of think up the reason. But I think you're right, Laura. I think that ultimately he was right. I think that the reason is a satisfying one.
So another aspect of the dream stuff is that there's this kind of repetition and reinvention. And actually, this was cued by some of the stuff you wrote about, Tom, in the book, especially on the fugue and And so these same sort of ideas reverberate and come back again and again in different forms. We revisit the same locations, but in different ways. Like the sort of house scene is their like living room or wherever. We get it sort of 3 times. Once when he's leaving, once when it's sort of bathed in light when they're coming to wake up again, and then once in limbo where now it's been refigured as a penthouse or whatever. But the other thing that was really interesting was like, you get these lines that keep getting repeated by various characters. So here, I tried to catalog some of the lines. I'll just read some of them. But what I found was that they're mostly Mal, Cobb, and Saito. Those are the 3 people who are doing the repeated lines, which was kind of interesting. So of course, Mal and Cobb, you would expect that they would be, this is a man kind of at war with himself, and simultaneously there's the aspect of Nolan and Emma Thomas being producing partners and all that. So there's this, of course, that's going to be an important connection. But I thought it was interesting that Saito is like in the mix. So here's some of the lines. So, waiting for a train, that line. You get that 3 times, I think, in the film. Old man filled with regret. That's Saito's. You get him Saito even says it first when he's recruiting Cobb, and then they say it to each other when Cobb is warning Saito that he might die and end up in limbo. And then they say it to each other at the end when he's sort of bringing him back. Leap of faith. That's another one that Saito says to Cobb. And Mal says it to Cobb as well. And then there's this idea of the ideas as virus or parasites. So Cobb talks about the resilient parasite at the beginning. And then when he's in limbo with Ariadne, he calls ideas viruses. They can grow. And that's what he's talking about happened with Mal. And then similarly, similar to the virus parasite thing is this sort of being possessed of an idea. So Saito says, a man possessed of radical notions. And Cobb is explaining to what happened to Mal, to Ariadne, he says the idea she was possessed by. So
Eventually, she told me the truth. She was possessed by an idea. This one very simple idea that changed everything.
And those seem to be the lines that are repeated most frequently. But it's interesting to me that Saito is involved in that. So it becomes like a triangle thing rather than just a dual relationship.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, they're the three characters we see in Limbo, aren't they? So it would be interesting that it would be those three.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. And then, you're pointing out a really, I think a kind of great sort of there's great credit to that script, and I think it's the best script he's ever written. But the way those phrases echo, and when you were saying them, I suddenly I had a visceral memory of kind of what it was when you heard those phrases in the movie. They do start to haunt the film, don't they? I mean, there's two things that when they get repeated, it has that kind of, without you knowing quite why, it has a haunted quality because you're an evocative sense of things, the sort of the gyre sort of turning, the circle completing. But then the other thing that he's doing is sort of setting plot points, and he's sort of saying, expect there to be, because both of those things appear at the end of the movie, an old man filled with regrets, and then the train. We finally find out, what that train is. We finally find out who that old man is. So he's doing a game of kind of sort of setting you up and just sort of, and he's using language and the script in a kind of, in the same way that he does with some of the sort of visual motifs. It's a really good point. I mean, it's just a sign of the richness of that script.
Absolutely. And one more just on the leap of faith. Mal takes a leap of faith. But what's interesting is that the first instance of leap of faith is Saito to Cobb. So it's like, you might wonder, so most of the time the reverberations start on the higher level and they reverberate downward, but that's something that's in his subconscious. Like that line is deep in his subconscious because it's the thing he said to Mal and she said to him, and that reverberates upwards into the top level.
It's migrated into another plot line with which it shouldn't have any contact. How did it get there?
Right. That's interesting. And you can see why he's having to constantly spin his token. He's feeling like that would be incredibly disturbing. For anybody to say that. Yeah.
That's right. Yep. God, that's very interesting. Yeah. And that's making me think, well, that's when you realize that the whole thing really just makes sense in the mind of Christopher Nolan, because that's really a screenwriter. That's when phrases migrate from one character to another character who shouldn't theoretically know about it, then you just sort of think, well, this is, you're very much struck by the kind of creator of the whole thing.
Yep.
I don't want to take us too far off the tangent, but I just wanted to note that, in terms of people accusing his movies of not being as emotional, and we talked a lot about how great the Mal and Cobb stuff is, the Fisher storyline hits me more every single time I watch it. I think Cillian's performance is really, clearly Nolan likes Cillian Murphy too. He puts him in everything he does almost. But I think his performance, he doesn't have as much screen time. He doesn't have, as much to work with as Leonardo DiCaprio does. But every time that parent-child relationship and the sort of exquisite reconciliation they have, even though it's under false pretenses, but still, emotionally valid for him and what he needs.
I agree.
He's lost his father. He's come to understand his father, but he doesn't really, it's all a lie. It's deeply emotional for me. I that for some reason, that's the part that keeps growing on me every time I come back to it.
I agree. Actually, that scene really hits me. And I feel like it's partly because it's something that I want to be able to have that kind of connection with, my family in that way that is sometimes hard to do outside of the outside of a dream, because it's just awkward and uncomfortable to get that emotional with someone. And clearly this was not going to happen outside of a dream. His dad was like a real asshole.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the catharsis is real. And it's like, I've had dreams where I've had experiences that lingered with me after I woke up. Like the whatever I experienced emotionally in the dream stayed with me in the way that it, not maybe to the same degree, but almost to the same degree that it would have had I had that experience in real life.
I know you were disappointed. I couldn't be you. No. I was disappointed. That you tried.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. I think any time that kind of parent-child relationships come up in his films, there's generally like there's an emotional charge there. You definitely see it in Interstellar for sure. That's the kind of absolute apotheosis of that. But it's there too in the kind of the orphaning of Bruce Wayne, and the emotions are there in that film too. More Batman Begins. I think The Dark Knight is the one that feels like that's the one he says anyway, that like, that's the one where he agrees with the critics that call him a cold and merciless critic. He was like, I'm inclined to agree with people that is a cruel film, that there is a coldness to that film, because there's very little kind of about sort of Bruce's sort of background in that. It really is the sort of Joker and Batman in this kind of death match, and it just kind of, it's like he called it a machine. It just goes on and on. But yeah, like Inception is I think the way those endings all happen at the same time, and some of them are sad and some of them are not. Some of them are goodbyes and some of them are kind of reconciliations, and that they're all interwoven at the same time. I think that is really, I really find that such a sort of fabulous kind of ending. And it's sort of this bittersweet and ambivalent, but sort of tying up of all these kind of ends, And there's a melancholy, I think, to Inception that I find. It's sort of there. It's not directly in any particular scene, although I think the Marl and Cobb stuff sort of touches on it a little bit, but those empty sort of cityscapes, and then the sort of the idea that you've got to return to reality and say goodbye to these dreams. There's definitely a sort of sadness in there, and it sort of reminds me a little bit of like how all the kind of old classics that people think of as the Hollywood system, whether it be Gone with the Wind or Casablanca, and you think of all those movies and like they were never afraid to sort of end on with a goodbye. It was E.T. does too. And it's like, and it's because I always figured it was because, at the end of the movie, like I've got to leave the movie theater. Like that to me is the sadness. I've got to say goodbye to these characters. So if to me, it made perfect sense that you would wrap up the movie with actually somebody parting. And so, Annie Hall, Casablanca, all these films, they end, though we think of them as being kind of warm, emotional, kind of very upbeat films, they end with, very sadly, really, but that's fine because I'm feeling sad to leave the film. And I think, and there's something of that in kind of Nolan too. I sort of definitely see that in Inception. He's it comes up a lot with the theme of sort of time with him, time is always kind of taking people away from him. It's, in his films, it's always sort of like, it's this sort of opponent of human connection. And it must be kind of outwitted or in some way. It's such a lovely theme. And I don't think he quite gets the kind of credit for it that, because I think, the films are quite evidently, clever and smart and beautifully engineered and all the rest of it. I think it's that one of those things where you almost don't notice that they've got an emotional, appeal on you. Like I always think that term is a little bit thrown around, like in the sense that a film that is genuinely has no emotional appeal. The experience of that is boredom. Like if you're simply unengaged emotionally on any level about a film, what you're actually experiencing is boredom. That's an unemotional film. If you're engaged in even the most basic sense of like hoping that guy crosses the bridge without falling off, that's an emotional involvement in the film. And that is obviously something that like is in his films is sort of there in spades. It's like in abundance.
That's the thing that always struck me about Dunkirk, because I am not much of a war movie person, and I don't. Justin will tell you I fall asleep during action set pieces all the time, because if it's just a bunch of planes, I'm like, there's no dialogue. I don't need to be here for this. I'll wake up when people start talking to each other again. So I didn't, the fact that I walked into a movie where there's almost no dialogue, no interpersonal conflict, no character growth. It's all action. It's a war movie. And I was engrossed from beginning to end. Like, it was a magic trick.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I mean, definitely. I mean, that's sort of, he finds it, he thinks Dunkirk is an emotional film. And
it is. It is.
And I think
I just didn't expect it to be.
Yeah. And, I think the emotions are there. They're just they're just deep down. And there's something kind of very unboastful. I think he just doesn't like. There's something kind of. He sort of doesn't like the showiness, perhaps, of like the idea that the emotion might be hidden is to him, I think, more interesting.
My hypothesis about the emotion and why people don't necessarily connect with Nolan the way that they think they should, if it's an actual emotional film, is that the emotions for Nolan are incredibly personal to him. And I think that it's just not the case that those emotions are as universally shared as like, I don't know, sadness or anger or something like that. Most of the emotional things in his film come from, at least in the latter part, come from the relationship between fathers and sons, or fathers and daughters, or at least parents and children. And that is in this film as well. And one of the things that, there's this guilt that Cobb is exercising throughout the film about his guilt about feeling like Mal has died has committed suicide because he incepted her. But there's another strand of guilt underneath it, I think, which is that Cobb and Mal have lived a lifetime together. We learn this towards the end of the film, without their kids. And they wanted that. They're like new parents who realize that now they can't do the fun creative activities they normally wanted. So they did them in a shared dream, and they lived like 60, 70 years there without the kid, and they enjoyed it. They enjoyed that time away from their children. Then they woke up and came back and realized, oh my God, am I a bad person for desiring to be away from my children so much? And that's one of these things that, like, as a parent, I understand, but if somebody's not a parent, they're not that's not going to resonate with them at all. That element of like feeling guilty that like you had this life away from your kids and now you have to deal with them.
I honestly, hadn't occurred to me, but I do think that's a great sort of reading of it. I mean, there's something. I think it definitely what they do. They go down there for however many years it is, and there's something very kind of poetic about it, and there's also something rather horrifying about it. It's like a kind of like in an Edgar Allan Poe story or something. There's something rather chilling, but there's something also too, like, who wouldn't want to do that? Like, who hasn't felt like when you're first in love with somebody that you don't want that experience to just go on forever and ever. But then if you do that at the expense of everything, reality, children, everything that you've left behind, then it's got the quality of like two heroin addicts who are just sort of, high all the time. And so there's something kind of terrible about it, as well as something kind of, very appealing.
To wake up from that after years, after decades, to become old souls thrown back into youth like that. I knew something was wrong with her. She just wouldn't admit it.
I think there's a lot of kind of interesting kind of compound emotions in his films, like things that like don't normally go together. I'm inclined to sort of think of that great scene in Interstellar where he watches the videos of his daughter,
Yes.
and she's growing up, and he realizes he's missed out on her childhood. And that scene is so interesting because the varieties of emotion are really quite. There's very many. Because on the one hand, there's the grief of, oh God, I missed out on the one thing I said I wanted to be there for, and then the guilt that comes from that. And then as he starts to watch it, you see like sort of actual fatherly pride too, because he's describing, oh really? And he's responding like, oh, that sounds great. And so there's that. And then, so there's all this kind of joy in them. And then also just, profound grief. Like, it's such a weird mixture. And it's like, there's almost terror too in his reaction, like, because it's like time is just terrifying. And there's sobbing at just this huge force, and it's like all that's sort of mixed up.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's just this compound. And I remember when I watched it, I was like, God, I've never experienced this ever in a movie. Like this thing that I'm experiencing now, this emotion that I'm feeling in response to this scene. Like, I have not experienced this before. So it's, I think you're right. Like a lot of his stuff kind of falls either between the cracks of sort of other more clearly marked emotions, or just kind of compounds things that you don't expect to go together. Grief and and happiness, and the ending of Inception, which kind of braids together all these different things, happy, sad, sort of. It's very. I always made me think a lot of C.S. Lewis. There's a lot of that in C.S. Lewis's books, but he hadn't read C.S. Lewis.
I forgot about that part of your book where you talked about that scene in Interstellar, and as you're relaying it here to me, I just want to say to the listeners, I mean, you really should read Tom's book. That part of the book was so profound and fascinating. I mean, the whole book is amazing. It's incredibly well written. But that part, when you're describing this emotion that you've never experienced before watching Interstellar, I too was like, you really put your finger on something profound about that movie that I hadn't realized. I mean, I had the emotional experience going through that with the character, but not with the words that you used. It brought out so much more. So I just want to shout out the book because it's fantastic.
Oh, that's really sweet. I mean, I thank you for saying that. I mean, I definitely love like the one thing that it was fun to do is like kind of go completely kind of macro, or is it micro anyway, on certain scenes, and just sort of like, because, and lose yourself in like a scene or and rather than kind of go through the whole thing, just kind of go in on the bits that really kind of resonate, and that was definitely one. And I was like, oh, you gotta sort of describe this well, rather than evaluate, because I think that the tendency would be to evaluate it and say this is great, or this is great filmmaking.
Sure.
But one of the things that was like, I mean, I think there's a John Updike quote actually, which I always love, where he sort of says, description is love. Meaning, if you're describing something, it's generally something that you love, and there's the love in the description of it. And so there was definitely an element of that. Like, all you have to do really is describe something, and then you've sort of paid tribute to it. So that's definitely what I was trying to do there.
And it comes through. I mean, and I would say actually that's a nice way of summarizing your approach to the book. It's a kind of criticism that is an engagement and a kind of appreciation and as you put it, description that isn't necessarily about evaluation, and that's one thing that's so refreshing about reading the book, and especially in this world where like when people talk about Nolan, it's either because they're fanboys or they hate him, or they're trying to like unpack the movie in some way, and there's not really been that much. It feels to me like your book is like one of the few things that, the sustained engagement with the work in a kind of literary way, an aesthetic way, and so on. And people do that with all kinds of other things. It's just that with Nolan, there's a bit of a blind spot for some reason because it's just dismissed as action filmmaking or something. And so yeah, it's a welcome addition to the canon of Nolan criticism.
Thank you so much.
So we're going to wrap up, and I think that the thing I just want to ask Tom is, so what are you working on next? Like, what's the next project?
Well, I haven't actually gone public with it yet, but I'm going to do another filmmaker, and in roughly the same kind of way, which is to say, with kind of close collaboration and by delving into all the kind of influences and inspirations and things like that. And hopefully it'll kind of allow people to see this sort of person from a slightly unfamiliar angle. So yeah, that's the basic idea.
Sounds great. Tom, where can people find you on social media?
Or
on the web?
Yeah, I mean, Instagram, Twitter. I think I've got a website, tomshone.net. That should have everything. tomshone.net should have all of the addresses for all the other social media stuff.
Perfect. And we are at cowspod on Twitter. You can find us at the web, cowspod.wordpress.com. Next week, we will be talking Tampopo with Nick Riggle, professor of philosophy at University of San Diego. So tune into that. Tom, thank you so much for being here. This was an absolute pleasure and joy. And yeah.
Ma vie